It has been so unbelievably cold in Canada, and I really need to weave something that makes me think of spring. So let's get started. Okay, so I have a couple ideas. Actually, I'm gonna get one of them. Basically, what I'm imagining in my head for this piece is to, first of all, put it in this shadow box. So I'm gonna make sure that my piece will fit in there. But what I'm imagining for this piece is a striped background and then a bird on top of that. And I'm almost thinking of doing this in more of a applique way than to needle felt directly onto the piece. So we're just gonna get started and see where this takes us. All right, so I'm gonna be using our Spruce and Linen flat pack frame loom. You can find these in our shop at spruceandlinen.com. I'm gonna be using 8/8 cotton for this piece. And the other piece that I'm kind of using as inspiration for what I want the background fabric, if you will, to look like, and it's this bookmark. I'm gonna put a link for this bookmark project right here. So if you need more detailed instructions, check out this tutorial because I go into a lot more depth with the twining, with how this is woven. It's more of a beginner tutorial. So the first thing I'm gonna do is tie an overhand knot into my warp string so that I can create a little loop. And I need to decide what size this piece is before I start warping. Maybe something like 7 3/4. I don't need to cover this completely because I do kind of like the look of the fabric in here. I think that's an advantage to using a shadow box like this one. So I'm gonna start on the second notch in, and I will be double warping this loom. So that means I'm going to be putting 2 warp strings in each notch. And again, if you want more specific, slower instructions for this, just check out that bookmark tutorial. I'll link it down below as well. So that looks good to me about there. Again, doesn't need to be super exact, so I'm not gonna be super exact. I'm gonna grab my scissors and then just cut this off and tie it at the bottom. I am both starting and stopping at the bottom of my loom because I do want there to be an even amount of warp strings. Next, I'm going to tape my loom down to the table so that it doesn't shift around on me. Next, I'm gonna grab a piece of cardstock that's gonna make the base of my weaving. The reason I use the cardstock is because it just gives you something that's straight and even to beat down onto so that you know the bottom of your weaving is going to be straight. It's just an easier way to do it than to be constantly measuring. My cardstock is about 3 inches tall. For this one, all I'm making sure is that I have enough room to weave that 7 3/4 approximate inches, and I definitely have lots of room for that. It's nice when we have some space at the top too, because the weaving tends to get tighter as you weave it. So being a little bit away from the top is helpful. So I'm gonna weave this in using over 2, under 2, all the way across my loom. For this piece, I'm gonna be using 2 different colors of this. This is considered a bulky weight. It's not super thick. I will link the specific one I'm using down below, but it is considered a number 5 or bulky weight yarn. So I'm going to grab a piece of the off-white, and I am gonna grab a generous amount. 3 arms lengths is basically the max of what I like to work with at a time. And I'm grabbing 2 tapestry needles. What I like to do when I'm working with 2 different colors, if I'm using an off-white, I will put the off-white in my maple tapestry needle, and then I'll put the whichever one is the darker one in the walnut, because then at a glance I know that my lighter needle is with my lighter color and my darker needle is with my darker color. Now I'm going to grab 3 arms lengths of this beautiful gold color as well and thread that through my walnut tapestry needle. Then I'm going to take my off-white yarn. I'm going to weave in over 1, under 1. I'm going to do a twining stitch on top of this plain weave row. The twining stitch just provides a lot of stability at the bottom of a piece and specifically helps the warp strings to not slip out of place once it's taken off the loom. And this twining stitch can be found in that same tutorial that I've been talking about for this bookmark. So I'm gonna try something a little bit different here, and I'm just gonna point it out because we're gonna see if it works. I like to kind of be the guinea pig for certain experiments. when it comes to weaving so that we can see if it works. So you'll see on this bookmark where I'm basically doing the exact same thing, I did a twining stitch and then I did a couple more rows of over one, under one plain weave before I went into my over two, under two. Now this time I'm just gonna have the twining stitch and I'm gonna go straight into weaving the pattern. So I'm gonna start with my off-white yarn and I'm gonna be weaving over two, under two, all the way across the loom. Now that I have my first row of the off-white, I can move on to the gold. So basically this pattern is you weave one color, then you weave the other. Now we want to weave it the opposite of what we just did. So I ended on going over these two warp strings. So the next row I'm going to go under. So this row is going to be under two, over two, under two, over two, all the way across. So I'm going to leave a nice long tail over here, just like I did over here, so I can tuck that in later. And now I'm going to go back to my off-white. Now what we need to do on a piece like this, because I need to go over again, and if I just went over, we'd end up like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around this yellow string. So I'm holding this up and then going over two, under two, and I'll show you how that kind of links the two rows. So you'll see this off-white yarn is kind of looping around this yellow one so that it can sit where we need it to sit. So now we're going back to the yellow, and this row will be a little bit different. So now I'm gonna leave this off-white sitting over, and I'm gonna go around that with the yellow. So I'm kind of going on top of it. Under, over, under, over. And once again, you'll see how this yellow is looping around the off-white so that we have a finished edge. So I'm just going to continue weaving, going back and forth between my gold and my off-white until I get to about 7 3/4 inches. All right, I finished this the same way I started it, so I finished off with a twining stitch. I do need to make sure that this top is a little bit straighter because right now I can see that there's a little bit of a angle going on this side, and I can even measure it from the top just to make sure. So now I'm gonna flip this over and tuck in all the ends. Something to note that I did is I almost got to the weaving being 7 3/4 inches tall, and I realized that I needed to account for the fact that I want a little bit of fringe on each end. So I'm gonna do about 1/2 inch of fringe on each end. So that means I only wove this to 6 3/4 instead of 7 3/4. All right, so I'm just gonna flip this over and start tucking in the ends. We'll get rid of this tape. The way that I connected my yarns once I ran out was I actually did it out in the middle instead of on the end because I really wanted to keep these ends looking like this, and I can see now there's quite a curve going down here, which I thought wasn't going to be as bad as it appears to be. Oh, it's not that bad. So because I connected them this way, I'm just gonna be laying them so that they kind of cross over each other and then tuck them in. All right, so all the ends are tucked in, and I mean, I can see the fact that this end might be a little bit wider than this end, but it's looking pretty even to me, and that's something I do want to just throw out there with weaving. Even if you give everything really great slack, it's usually not going to come out perfectly straight. This is pretty good, I would say. And obviously you can work really hard to get it as straight as possible, but when we can't adjust the tension, which we can't on a frame loom, it is a little bit trickier. So don't be too hard on yourself if you have a little bit of wonkiness there. So I'm gonna take that cardstock out and we're gonna get this off of the loom. You might be thinking, actually, should I be taking this off yet? Let's hit pause. I was gonna take this off the loom because I think what I wanna do with this one is actually do a little bit of an applique style needle felt bird on this. And I have this sheet of felt here. So my thoughts were to actually needle felt the bird and then cut a rectangle or a square and actually stitch it onto the piece. And I think I still wanna do that because I wanna just try something a little bit different than needle felting directly on the piece, just to see what that looks like. So I'm gonna bring up the bird that I found, and I think I'm actually going to trace it because I'm just not entirely sure what size I want it to be. So I'm gonna trace it off of my iPad. Just like in one of my most recent videos, I have this Canva document where I just like save a bunch of stuff that I'm like, ooh, that would be fun to try to needle felt. And I'm gonna use my measuring tape here to figure out how big this should be. I could even use the square of this to kind of decide how big the piece of felt should be. So right now this is just a little over 4 inches. That's pretty big. We're gonna end up covering up so much of the piece. So I don't think I wanna go that big. And I guess the reality is too, I could cut the felt smaller than what's here, but I wanna make sure that the bird is gonna be big enough to needle felt, but small enough to fit on here. So what does 3.5 look like? 3.5 by 3.5 is pretty decent. The bird itself is about 2 3/4. I think that would work. I don't know if this is gonna work very well because obviously, as you can see, as soon as I touch the iPad, things wanna move around. So I have printed out the bird. So I will have a link for this, a link or a download or something for you in the description box below. Now, what I'm thinking I'm gonna need to do is cut this out so that I can almost use it, I can just trace it onto my felt. So I'm gonna do it in 2 sections. I'm gonna cut this top part of the bird with the wing, and then the bottom part of the bird, I'm gonna leave the feet because they're so thin anyway that I'll just kind of eyeball those. So I've cut out this portion of the bird, and I think I'm gonna go ahead and trace that now. Then I can cut out the rest of it and get that line as well. So we'll try that. I'm gonna do the wing on top of everything else. Then it'll almost, I think, give it a bit of a 3-dimension feel to the wing part. Okay, so I have that first part of the bird traced out on my felt. Now I can go ahead and cut out this gold part. So now I should be able to just lay this back on top and get this line here. Okay, that looks really good actually. And then I can keep looking back at this as well as a reference for like the colors and everything like that. Now that I have that in place, I'm gonna grab my felting pad, my very well used felting pad, and I'm going to start felting just directly onto this felt. A very brief explanation of needle felting. You need to use special needles that have little burrs. You need to use wool, and the combination of those things felts the wool. So there's little burrs on felting needles that basically tangle up the wool, and I'm gonna be felting right through this piece of felt, but every once in a while I'm gonna lift it off the felting pad because it's gonna wanna felt directly into the felting pad. So I'm gonna start down by the tail. I think I might fold this end over a little bit. And my goal here is going to be to completely cover up my marker line because we obviously don't wanna see that. So that's gonna be where I'm aiming for so that we don't see any of the marker when I'm done. So I'm just going in and out with the needles. And again, basically what this is doing is tangling up the wool. It's kind of similar to backcombing, which I know sounds odd, but if you think about how you're, when you're backcombing, you're pushing a comb up into the hair and knotting it up. This is kind of the same thing. It's just instead we're going all the way through whatever material we're needle felting into. So you can see I'm starting with just covering up those marker lines. I think that's kind of the easiest place to start, and then I can go back out into the middle. Now there is a chance I might have to add a little bit more wool because the thing about felting of any kind is it wants to sort of like it tightens everything up and gets a little bit smaller, like it's shrinking a little bit. So I need to be really careful that I'm not allowing that line to show through, because I definitely don't want to be seeing a Sharpie line on my piece. And then here you can see what it's doing when I'm felting through the felt. So it's coming all the way through, and it's almost like Velcro. So if I really yanked on this at this point, I could take it off. Once you felt it a lot, it won't come off. But at this point, I could pull it out, probably. I'm not gonna actually do that, but that's kind of how it stays inside of the felt in this case. But I've also done needle felting directly on weavings as well. And I'm also using this 3 needle felting tool right now because it's gonna make it a lot faster when I'm doing the main portions. Once I get into more details, I can go down to the single one. I'm really liking the way and I totally did not do this on purpose, so it's just kind of a fluke. The way that the fibers are laying actually is really looking like the way a bird's feathers would lay, because I mean, that's something to think about, I guess. I just thought of it now. I mean, I laid this down this direction just because it gives me the most length, but when you lay them down that way, it actually kind of mimics the way that the feathers would lay. So anyway, just a random detail that you might want to think about. I can already tell you, like, you can see the marker down here. So I'm definitely gonna have to pull that apart. The nice thing about felting directly onto a piece of felt is that you don't have to needle felt a ton. Like, I'm kind of almost done that already. Now, like I just said, I need to add a little bit more thickness to the tail, just because the marker is definitely showing. And I might try to purposely take it just a little bit longer, so I know that for sure that marker line won't be showing up. And then I'm noticing on my little pattern here, there's a little bit of a point right there. So I might try to emphasize that a little bit, maybe with my single needle felt, but I can also do that later. We'll get into the details towards the end. And now I'm gonna do the belly portion. So that's gonna be this really nice gold color. So I'm gonna take a piece of this. I wanna make sure it's not gonna be too terribly long. I think this might work pretty good though. I'm gonna start in the middle. I have too much wool right here. So I'm gonna, again, just pull some of that off the best I can. I'm just kind of doing it in little bits so it's a little bit easier. And that's probably gonna be enough that I could just sort of fold this over. It's gonna be a little bit thicker in this spot, but I think that'll be okay. She says, not really knowing. Oh yeah, I think that'll be okay. So yeah, there's a little, you know, this is a little bit funky right here, but hopefully I can just kind of blend that in. And something else you can do if you're finding that your felt is looking really, like, you can see all the little needle holes, you can kind of use those needles to just comb that back out a little bit, just so it looks more smooth again. So here's the point where I might switch to my single needle just to get some of these little spots more defined. This could go a little bit pointier right here. So now I'm kind of ready to start the wing. So I could just cut that out. So if I cut that out, I can lay the tail on, and then we'll cut this out. And that's where my wing is gonna go. So what's the best way to do that? That's the question. I might just use my marker again to sort of mark it. Revolutionary, using a marker to mark things. So I'm just gonna do like almost little dots this time. And now I will grab some of this orange. So when I first put the wool on, I'm just really lightly felting so I can like make sure everything's in place before I try to felt it completely. And again, I can always add more on top of this if I need to. which I might have to, and that's totally fine. Then once again, I have a little bit too much on this end. So I'm just gonna try to pull some of that away, and then hopefully I can fold this over. Okay, so I think I have the general shape pretty good, but right up here, this I think needs to be a little bit more rounded, and I might need to add just a little bit more wool, just right in this little area here. Okay, I'm really enjoying needle felting into this felt, because again, you just don't have to felt it quite as much. And you can see it's really coming through, and that's awesome. So I'm gonna move on to the beak and the eye. The eye is gonna be interesting, but I'm gonna grab a little bit of black, and I'm just gonna go ahead and get that beak in place. Okay, so the beak is now in place, and it's really starting to come together. I really love how simplified this bird is, because the last time I did a bird, it was quite a lot larger and it was more detailed and it was a challenge. And so it's kind of nice to like back up and do something a little bit more simple. So next, I would like to add these little details that this one had. I could stitch them in. I wonder if that would be cuter. Let's do the eye first, since I know I'm gonna needle felt that. So I just grabbed a really thin piece, and I'm gonna kind of just try to ball it up. And the eye is gonna go right about here. I'm just trying to make sure it's about in the same spot as the other one. So laying it on there, I think I'm pretty close. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I just feel like sometimes if you get some of the positioning wrong, you're just looking at it thinking like, why does that not look like the thing it's supposed to look like? And now I'm gonna try to make it a little bit more circular. Okay, I'm liking the position of that. So now the tricky part is gonna be adding that teeny tiny black dot. So I'm gonna grab super small amount of black, and I'm gonna roll it up as tightly as I can. And I think my goal here will be to just barely needle felt this in, because it needs to be quite small. Okay, I think that that looks pretty good. So let's move on to, I'm thinking the feet. So we kind of want to start the feet right here. This is going to be a little bit tricky, and I'm thinking I'll use the brown for the feet because that's kind of what's in this picture, and I'm liking that. So I'm going to start 1 foot. Is it about there? Okay, so kind of like this. I'm trying to replicate this angle here. Feet are going to be a little tricky, so I'm just going to slowly work these in. My foot's coming out okay. It's looking a little bit more like a duck foot right now than maybe a more claw-like foot should, but I can refine that as I go. I'm gonna add the second leg in just so I can have a clearer picture in my mind of how this is going. So my feet are obviously a little bit less dainty than these ones because these are really small, but I actually think they look pretty good. So I think I'm gonna stop while I'm ahead because it is like kind of tricky to do the super fine details, and I could spend more time on it, but I'm pretty happy with it. So the next thing I need to do is just figure out if I want to add these detail lines, and I kind of think I do, just because it is a very basic bird, and I do think that would add something nice. So I'm gonna quickly add these little black lines because I think they do add something that's kind of nice and cute. So I'm basically just gonna mimic the lines that are on my reference again. This time I'm just eyeballing it because they're so narrow. And just like with the eye, I'm not gonna needle felt these very much, just until they're about the width that I want them to be. And this might have been honestly too much. I'm actually really happy with the little additional lines. Now I need to cut it out so that we have a full square. And so that's where this is gonna come in handy. I think I could just use my Sharpie again for this. So basically when I cut this out, I'll just be cutting the marker line off. Kind of looks like the bottom is no longer straight, so I might actually have to straighten that out as well, because I think as I was needle felting, things can get a little misshapen, which is why I didn't want to cut out my square first. All right, so I have my little square. So now we're gonna have the moment of truth where I lay this on top of the weaving to see if it's actually gonna look good. So let's just set all of this stuff aside for now. And I'm not gonna lie, I am actually kind of tempted to just glue this on. I don't really want stitch lines, but what I need to decide is if it's gonna go this way or if it's gonna go that way. Let's just imagine this. I kind of think I like it this way better, but I'm gonna take this off the loom. This time I am gonna use a rotary cutter. Oh no, guys. I messed up. Okay, since I messed up, I am now gonna have to cut them all shorter. I think that's the first time I've like really messed up my fringe, to be honest. So that's pretty good considering I've been doing this for a while. So I'm gonna go really short with my fringe. It is what it is. Honestly, it's kind of cute, so I'm not mad about it, but not what I was aiming for. And you would think after I mess up, I wouldn't be eyeballing it, but I am, because I just kind of want to get this done now. So it is what it is. I think this frame actually turned out to be such a cute frame for this. So then all I need to do is figure out where center is. So side to side will be pretty easy because my piece is symmetrical. So I'm just gonna like look at the lines of where it should end up, and it should end up between this yellow line and that yellow line. So now I just need to figure out top and bottom. So let's have a look here. That's 2 inches. Oh man, I had it like perfect. I love when that happens. Okay, so it's basically exactly where it should be right now. So if this is hot enough, which it looks like it is, I'm gonna carefully glue this. And if you don't want to glue it, you could definitely stitch it if you would prefer. But I'm a pretty big fan of hot glue personally. And I think for this piece, because this is quite small, I really only need to be doing the edges. Maybe I'll do 1 line in the middle just to be safe. Okay, so my piece is now glued on. I really like it. I think it's quite cute, and I think I'm happy with that. So I'm gonna open up the shadow box and we're gonna get it in there. And I'll probably start with the corners. It came with a couple of little pins, but I kind of want to use, I have some more here. These ones have a smaller head, and I think that's what I want to use just so that I can hide them in there a little bit more. So you have to put them at quite an angle to do this, just because that foam back in there is pretty thin. The other thing you can do if you're sure that you want this on here is you could actually glue your piece to this, but I think it's kind of nice to be able to just pin it in there so that if you ever wanted to switch it out, you can. All right, you guys, it's all done. So let's have a look at the finished piece. I really enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, check out this one next. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more.